So how many of you are currently listening to a podcast? And if you don't know what a podcast is, bear with me. How many of you listen on a regular basis? A few. How many have ever listened to a podcast? How many of you are producing podcasts right now?
If we have in the past but are not currently.
If you have in the past, I'll take that.
There.
Okay, good.
Nice.
Planning to? Anyone planning to do a podcast? Maybe you'll change your mind up, or maybe you'll do it after this. I hope so. I hope so. So some of the ones I'm showing you here have been around a while. Mark Maron does the WTF, and you all know what that stands for, podcast. And he even had President Obama come on his show. President Obama went out to Mark's garage in California. Mark didn't even go to the White House. That's how influential Mark's become. There's Freakonomics, there's Radio Lab, there's our friend Mitch Joel who does 6 Pixels of Separation. There are lots of great podcasts out there today. I've been doing one since 2005, and if I had known that I was still doing one, I would have picked a better name than something based on my domain name, Trafcom News. Worst podcast name ever. Do as I say, not as I do. But I've had fun producing my own, and I also do them for clients, mostly these days, much more often for clients than for myself, like the Shoemaker's Children. I like it so much that I wrote a couple of books, the latest of which is The Business of Podcasting that I did with my friend Steve Lubetkin, and it's about the business side, obviously. It's not a how-to podcast book. The simplest definition of a podcast is that it's like an internet radio show. So just imagine that if you have a subject that you're interested in, a niche topic, you could have your own radio show. Does that sound appealing? No? She's like, no way. Some people think it's appealing. The fact is, if you did have a niche topic idea and you went to a regular radio station and said you wanted to do a show on the history of insects or something, they might say, that's a little too narrow for us. But you could do your own show on just about anything. And believe me, if you look at iTunes or any other podcast directory, there is a podcast about everything. Even in the early years of podcasting, there were multiple shows about knitting. This was audio, okay? Audio podcasts about knitting. Anyway, so that's a definition. And because I like to be a picky podcaster, I will just let you know the difference between any old audio, like what I'm recording right now, will probably be any old audio. It won't be a podcast per se. What makes something a podcast, and a podcast can be audio or video, is the fact that it is serial in nature. So it comes out with some frequency. It might be daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, every once in a while. There's more than one. And people can subscribe to them. Just like you can subscribe to a blog, you can subscribe to a podcast. They're free on iTunes, by the way. One of the things Allison alluded to was the fact that some shows you can get extra content that you pay for. That's different. If you go to iTunes and you want to set up your podcast there, Apple says it has to be free there. Any old audio, you can't subscribe to it, and it's not serial. Speaking of serial, for some of us, not for me, but for a lot of people, Serial, the season 1, was the entree. I see people smiling. Was their entree into podcasting. How many of you discovered podcasts because of Serial season 1? A few of you. Did you hear of it at the time, even if you didn't listen? I know I've been podcasting, as I said, for many years. My millennial daughter was living with me at the time Serial came out, and she rushed in the door one day. Mom, you've got to listen to this podcast I discovered. It's called Serial. And I said, yes, Claire, I'm aware of this podcast. And she was almost telling me as if I didn't even know what a podcast was. I was like, look around at all the recording gear and the microphones and stuff. It was quite funny. It was like this clash of, oh, yes, Mom does this. Ooh, I didn't know. Anyway, it really did seem to put podcasting on the map for a lot of people. All of a sudden, we were hearing people talk about podcasting a lot more than they were before. However, even though Serial seemed to explode with all these listeners, lots of engagement, there were spin-off shows, there were websites, there were discussion groups, people were talking about it. The fact is that if you look at the stats, and I'm going to show you some stats, podcasting has grown every year since it has existed. Serial, for a lot, anecdotally, seemed to be the catalyst, but really, podcasting has been growing every year. There are more brands producing podcasts these days. I'm noticing more and more. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that. And I think one of the reasons for the popularity of podcasts, or the growing popularity recently, is it's easier to produce them now. I'm going to walk you through in a little while how you do one, but in fact the tools are much easier. When I started, 2005, I was combing websites, how do you do this? And I'd get a little snippet of information from this person, a little snippet from this person, and by trial and error and lots of painful mistakes, figure it all out. Now, of course, there are tons of books and courses and everything, and lots of information out there, and apps that you can get that simplify a lot of these things. And there are an increasing number of networks out there now. I'm going to show you a few examples. So networks are when podcasters get together, or an organization gets together with podcasters to support them, perhaps do some advertising. You know, it's easier to approach advertisers if you have a bank of so many shows rather than one, and just for support and resources. And some of them get funding from either organizations or governments or whatever, quasi-government usually. And there's also something interesting that's happened the past few years called Patreon. And I think we've talked about it in class, because you can support a blogger through a Patreon campaign or a podcaster. Jesse Brown, how many of you listen to Canada Land, or you're aware of it anyway? I know I heard Allison's name on the podcast once. We know when they read the names of supporters. Actually, one of our students here said she actually got into trouble one time because her name was announced when he was doing a controversial show, so she became associated with that topic, and she was involved with the organization. So you never know what could happen. Wow. But that's an unusual situation. Canada Land is a media criticism show. Jesse Brown was one of the people involved in bringing the Jian Ghomeshi allegations to life. So he's not afraid to poke at things. So when you're a person like that, it's pretty hard to get someone to pay you to do media criticism. So Jesse went to his listeners. First he had some advertisers, and then he decided, well, I'll still have advertisers, but he asked his listeners, if I asked you for $1 or $2 or $5 or $10 a month, would you support me? And guess what? Right now, I checked last week, 3,100 and change people are giving him $16,000 a month to produce Canada Land. Now he's been able to hire people and do lots more work with more frequency because of this support. So you can see where a platform like Patreon wasn't around a few years ago, how would we have supported? We're all going to write him a check, you know, send him something on PayPal, like that's just so cumbersome. Here you just sign up to be a patron, put your credit card in, and you're not going to miss that $1 or $2 a month. Yes, Reka?
Is it kind of like a crowdfunding site?
Yes, it's sort of like crowdfunding, exactly, where you're signing up to be a patron, but instead of just a one-time thing, let's pay for someone's surgery or their wheelchair or something like that, you are giving this on a monthly basis until you stop it. Okay, so there's a little difference there. It's like thinking being a patron of the arts, right? Something like that. That's the name Patreon. I think it's a great name. And there is a social media aspect of it too, where if you support someone, you can tell your friends and maybe they'll support them. And this has gone up because I remember last semester, I think it was at 11,000 or something. So it's he's probably been campaigning more for it. So I mentioned earlier podcast networks. One of my favorites is the For Immediate Release podcast network. My friend Shel Holtz, some of you, if you're a member of IABC, you may know Shel. He's in California. And he had a podcast called For Immediate Release about public relations and social media. And now he's in charge of a whole network of different communications-related podcasts. There's WNYC, Radiotopia, which is part of the, you'll see PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. Rabble that Allison mentioned is a nice Canadian progressive network. And then there's Nerdist, which from the name is obviously what it's about, nerdy stuff. But there are lots of networks out there, so it's easier for podcasters who have a great idea to go to a network and get support. I was actually at the presentation at PodCamp this weekend. There was someone there from CBC talking about how to pitch your podcast to CBC so that you would have the support. Now they are a radio network, obviously, but they're getting more involved in podcasting. So what are the benefits to us as we listen to podcasts? Anybody, why would you listen to a podcast? Yes? Entertaining. Some of them are very entertaining. Yes, Reka?
Just get information.
Information. Anyone else? Educational, entertaining. What I like about it is the time shift aspect of it. I can listen to it when it's convenient for me. I may not be around at noon on a Saturday to listen to a certain program, but I can listen to it whenever I want, and also wherever I want, whether I'm on the GO train or at home or wherever I am exercising. And it's free. As I mentioned, podcasts are free to you, and they can certainly be educational or entertaining. I know the For Immediate Release podcast that I listen to, I try to listen every week. It's about an hour. I find sometimes I'm getting another degree in communication just listening to all the conversations and learning so much from the people that are on the shows. But what are the benefits to the people who produce the podcast? Why would we go through all this trouble?
Advertising.
It could be a form of marketing for sure, yes? Doing what you love, yes. Some of us really like to talk, yes.
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech, that's an interesting one. Yes?
I guess you would reach a lot of people if it's on internet.
You can reach a lot of people. It's getting a little more cluttered now, though. The thing was, when I started, I was one of the first business podcasts in Canada. It was a little bit almost easier to get an audience, even though it's hard for people. They say, what's a podcast? How do I listen? Yes? It's a place to store your ideas and share your ideas for sure. Anyone else? These are all great. So the idea is reaching that niche audience, and it could be a really narrow audience. One of the people I interviewed for the Business of Podcasting book, Todd Cochran, said, imagine if you did a podcast geared to neurosurgeons and you had a sponsor, you wouldn't need to reach a lot of neurosurgeons. That is a very targeted market, a very affluent market, and if you had an advertising sponsor who wanted to reach that group, you don't need millions, you just need maybe hundreds or maybe even thousands. It is easier to produce than video, and I wouldn't say that you should choose audio over video just because it's easier. Most things in life that are just easier are not always the better option. But when I look at a client and they have an idea of doing audio or video, I mean, right now I'm recording this. I just have to worry about what I'm saying. I don't have to worry about my hair, my clothes, my lighting. I couldn't wear this jacket on video because it would be jumpy. It's expensive to do video. You usually need more resources, although we're going to do them very quick and cheap in 2 weeks in this class. But in general, audio is easier to produce than video. Would you agree, those who've done video, would you say? Yes? I mean, with video, you still need good audio, but you need all the other visual stuff on top of it, right? Then there's this thing we call the intimacy of the earbuds. Has anyone ever heard this phrase? And it goes like this. The idea is that if you listen to someone's podcast on a regular basis, especially with those earbuds as opposed to, say, speakers on a kitchen radio, you start to feel like you have an affinity for that podcast, or you start to feel like you know them. And I've experienced this on both sides, as a listener and as a producer. And the idea is that if you're a smart podcaster, you appeal to the person as if you're speaking with them one-on-one. So in other words, you don't say something like, hey, everybody out there. You say something like, I have a story to share with you today. And then the person's like, ooh, what's the story? She's telling me a story. So it's that idea of that intimacy of the earbuds. You may see this phrase now that you've heard of it. Another nice thing about audio is that you can repurpose and repackage that material. So once you have, suppose you have published an interview, maybe it's for your organization, you publish an interview with a CEO or with somebody, you can get a transcript of that. You can use that for some blog post, or maybe it'll be part of a white paper or an article or something else. Often I will advise clients to do something like that, is to don't just let the interview live on its own, do something else with that material because you've gone to the trouble of getting the audio. It's easy to get a transcript done. Edison Research is an organization that's been mapping both podcasting and radio for years. And these are the latest stats, and it's interesting. These are American stats. And when I met the fellow from the CBC last week, I asked him, because he was citing some stats, and I said, how close were the American and Canadian stats? I suspected they were very close. He says, as far as CBC was concerned, they're the same for these types of stats that I'm showing you. So awareness of the term podcasting has been growing. This is in the US, so they're estimating 150 million people are at least aware. I still get people saying to me, I have a really embarrassing question to ask you, Donna, and they sort of look around furtively. What's a podcast? And I tell them. Monthly listenership is going up, and as not surprising, the people who listen to podcasts are highly educated. One more thing to say about monthly listening. A lot of studies have found that people who listen to a podcast tend to listen to more than one podcast. And that's probably true for those of you who you don't listen to one show. You might have started with Serial or something else, but then you start hearing about other podcasts. So that's usually what happens. So highly educated, affluent, all the things you might expect. And anyone else have a question about podcast demographics that you might be thinking about? I think the male-female is fairly close. If you go to Edison Research, to their site, looked for the share of ear studies or any of their other studies, they have tons of statistics on this stuff because they have reports that you can buy, but they have a lot that's freely available. Any questions about so far what we're talking about, demographics or podcasting in general? I wanted to play 3 short clips for you. It's about 4 minutes altogether, 4.5 minutes altogether. And I want you to listen critically to these 3. They're very different from each other.
Perpetual adaptation, digital marketing strategies for independent communicators. Hi, this is Donna Papacosta, and you're listening to the IndieCast, a production of the Professional Independent Communicators, which is part of IABC Toronto. I'm excited to tell you about our next professional development event on March 2nd, 2017 in the evening with guest speaker Alison Garwood-Jones. Alison is a Toronto-based writer and illustrator. She's also an instructor in digital strategy at the University of Toronto School of Continuing Studies, and she is the host of willfulproject.com, a web series that tracks how creative entrepreneurs work, thrive, and survive. Alison's going to talk about how she reinvented herself in this rapidly changing world of digital media. Here's a conversation with Alison. Alison, it's so good to talk to you about this topic today.
Well, thank you, Donna. I appreciate the opportunity.
Now, you're going to be sharing with the PIC members and guests a conversation about this idea of adapting and continuously adapting. And I know you're going to share a little bit of your story about how you came to where you are in your profession today, right?
Yes. I'll share a little bit about my evolution from being an art historian working in museums, but mostly it's going to focus on the last 10 years of my life as a communicator, starting as a journalist and then moving through that evolution, because we all know that the journalistic landscape right now is on fire, burning to the ground. So, this is...
You're listening to The Best Laid Plans, a satirical novel of Canadian politics, podcast by the author Terry Follis, one chapter at a time. Now, from his home in Toronto, here's Terry.
Hi again, and welcome back to the podcast version of The Best Laid Plans. This actually is the last installment in the adventures of Daniel Addison and Angus McClintock. Yes, this is the final chapter in the novel. I'm certainly grateful that so many of you have tuned in, and I really hope you've enjoyed it. Please keep an eye on the blog for publishing updates. I certainly expect we will have the novel out sometime in the summer. Here's Chapter 19. Ottawa is one of the world's coldest capitals, and we're used to it now. The snow falls early, often, and heavy, yet slows the city rarely and barely.
Grammar Girl here. Today, guest writer Bonnie Trenga is helping us talk about 2 sets of words that listeners get confused: pleaded guilty or pled guilty, and use or utilize. But first, check out our sponsor, audiblepodcast.com/GG, for a free trial and a free audiobook download. That's audiblepodcast.com/GG. Mike from Georgia is transitioning from law enforcement to freelance writing and wants to know which is correct. He pled guilty or he pleaded guilty. He says that some of the people he calls his hoity-toity friends claim that pleaded is always right, but he's heard educated people use pled. Don't be afraid to argue with a grammar snob on this issue, because in America, Scotland, and some areas of the UK, you could use pled if you wanted to, but you should also be prepared to...
Okay, I'm going to stop that one there. You have to listen to Grammar Girl to get the rest of it. What was the first clip I played? That was a little bit obvious, that one. Well, it was a promotion of the event where Alison Garwood-Jones is speaking to Thursday night. I keep saying tomorrow, Thursday night. And that's something I do as a member of IABC Toronto, of our Professional Independent Communicators Group. But it's something that any organization can do, even a nonprofit, for almost no, well, really no cost, to promote their events and also to give some profile to the speakers. Often when we invite speakers, they're happy that we have this little podcast, especially when you are a small organization, you don't have a big budget to pay speakers. They're often happy, or no budget to pay speakers. They're often happy that they're getting promoted through something like the podcast. Plus, we have had people come out to our meetings say, I came out because I heard this interview with so-and-so, Allison or whomever, and I thought it was worthwhile. So a lot of my clients will do these kinds of shows before an event, a big conference or something like that, not just a one-off type of thing. So using a podcast to me to promote something like an event is a simple thing to do. What was the second clip? Yes?
It was Terry's book.
You know Terry?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who doesn't know Terry Follis? And did you know him you know him for a long time when he came out with the book?
Yeah, I've known him for...
Okay. Okay, so you know him longer than I do. I know him probably 12 years. So when Terry Follis, F-A-L-L-I-S, came out with his first book, The Best Laid Plans, he, like a lot of writers, didn't get a publisher, right? It's pretty hard to get published. So back in the day when there was still almost a little stigma to self-publishing, I'm looking at you to correct me if I got the story wrong, he went and he self-published it, but before he did that, he started to read one chapter at a time every week, because he was already doing a podcast with his business partners for a public relations podcast called Inside PR, which he's no longer involved with but is still going. Anyway, people like me who knew Terry said, well, I guess I'll listen, check out this book, and then thought, this is a really good book. I want to buy this book. So then all of a sudden you could buy the book. Well, Terry went on to fame and probably fortune now. He won the Stephen Leacock Medal for humor writing. He's won, you name the Canadian award, he's won it. They made Best Laid Plans into a CBC miniseries, which I thought was hilarious. I think it was a stage play in Vancouver. I mean, I think it's his fifth or maybe it's his sixth novel that's coming out now. But he still continues to read them for free as a podcast. Now, some people say, why would he do that? Doesn't he want people to buy the book? Why do you think he would do it? Yeah, I agree. A lot of people will listen to it and say, this is something I want to read, or I want to support the author too. And it's worked for him. It gives people a taste of the writing, and I think it's something he enjoys doing as well. Yes?
It could also be the reverse, where the author...
That's a good point. You may have read the book first and then listened to the audio. That's true. That's very true. So it's worked well for Terry, and he was an early adopter of doing this. Now a lot more authors are using audio either to read chapters of their book or to just talk about their book and the subject matter. My co-author and I, Steve Lubetkin, we've done a couple of podcasts just talking about different aspects from the book. Yes, Allison?
To me, it comes back down to the intimacy of the earbuds.
Yeah.
I remember when Frank McCourt came out with his Angela's Ashes, and I read it, but I wanted to hear him read it.
Yeah.
I knew it would be much more moving.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Something like that. And it's funny, sometimes it works the other way, where you love a book and then you hear the author's voice and you want to scream.
Yeah.
And sometimes they will actually hire a professional artist, voiceover artist, to read the book in that situation. But McCourt, I would love to. I mean, I've read Angela's Ashes several times. It's just such a beautiful book. Any other comments on Terry or authors and their podcasts? I think it's really interesting. What was the third one? Grammar Girl. Has anyone heard of Grammar Girl? Her actual name is Mignon Fogarty. And I had the pleasure of finally meeting her in person 2 years ago at a conference. We were at a podcasting conference in Las Vegas. She started Grammar Girl. She actually started a podcast before that. She was doing technical scientific writing, and she started a science podcast that no one listened to. And she was listening to what everyone said, pick a niche topic. Well, she went against the common wisdom, and instead of sticking with a niche topic, she decided to do a really broad topic, English language grammar, right? So we have all of North America, lots of people all over the world who want to get better at the English language. So she started off simply covering things like the difference between accept and accept and its and stuff that people say is basic. And one semester, one of my students said, well, that's so simple. Anybody could have done that. And do you know what my answer was? Did you? So Mignon thought of it first. Okay, let's give her credit. But she did it really well. And then she wrote a book, of course, as one does. Wound up getting on Oprah with her book. Now, you get on Oprah with your Grammar Girl book, that thing is going to sell like crazy. And so she's done a lot of other things with podcasting since then. She now has a whole network. Again, simple topics, manners, finance, parenting, pets. Things like that where you say, well, that's not so hard to do. Okay, well, you do it. Anyway, Mignon has been very successful with Grammar Girl. So it goes against that common wisdom that we always talk about, niche topic. Just to prove that, so the niche topic must be a truism if we can find that, right? But there are lots of different kinds of podcasts. Within organizations, they're often used for training and learning for employees or for customers. Messages from leadership, whether it's a CEO or somebody else. Interviews, group discussions. There are lots of publicly available podcasts that are political in nature or technical in nature, like Leo Laporte does a whole bunch of them, talking about technology. Other people do them talking about politics. Entertainment or comedy, sports, politics, you name it. Business and finance. You name the topic, whether it's pornography or feminism or politics or mutual funds, there is a podcast about it. Charity and nonprofit. A lot of companies or organizations, I should say, that don't have big budgets for other communications projects can often produce a podcast, especially if they have someone in-house with that expertise. And I've done them when I lived in Oakville. I used to do some for the Oakville YMCA in the early days of podcasting. And it was a great way to share stories. We were doing a series for people who were beneficiaries of some of the programs at the Y. In other words, there was a program where you would donate money and a family would be able to go to the Y if they wouldn't otherwise afford to do so. But these two groups never met each other face to face most often, or if they did, they didn't know they were meeting each other. So we were able to sit down with the people with their agreement, first names, and talk about, and I mean, it was so hard for me, I'd be in tears as I was editing these things because the stories were so touching. And the people who were writing the check said, you know, we really like this because it's easy to write the check, but now I'm really thinking about what I'm doing, and maybe next time I'll give a little more because now I feel like I know the people that are receiving these donations. Events and conferences, I've already mentioned, whether it's a pre-event podcast or during the event or even after the event to get people to go next year. You do a little sizzle reel of people talking about how great this conference was so that maybe next year people will go to their boss and say, you got to send me to this conference. Listen to what these people said about it. There's lots of examples out there. We could spend the next week showing you examples. This is one from Shopify, TGIM. Thank God it's Monday. So they have this podcast for business people. And I think they're really good with coming up with headlines. Business lessons from prison. Isn't that something you want to listen to? Killer crowdfunding and what they don't teach you in business school. This is one I do for a client, Generation ETFs. I really love their logo. It's about exchange-traded funds. That is definitely a niche topic, something I didn't know about before I started having to interview these people. The next generation of investing belongs to ETFs. So that's what they talk about. Internal podcasts. I just saw today on Facebook, Shell Holtz was talking about who has examples of internal podcasts. So I sent him this slide. Big companies, obviously, but some not so huge, like Royal LePage, and I know about theirs because I'm working with them on one for their brokers and their managers. So I would consider that internal because it's not available to the public. So an internal podcast is not going to replace the intranet and the newsletter and other ways that you communicate with people, but it can be just another channel to tell the stories of the employees and what's going on in the organization. Yeah, they usually are subscribable. Often, though, they are behind a firewall, so it's a little bit different. Now, I'm able to subscribe to some of my client ones just with the URL because I have access to it. But often, it's a little different if you're doing it internally because you don't want the whole world to hear it. Although I always tell people, don't put anything in the podcast that you wouldn't want someone to hear. It's just like a newsletter. You don't have any guarantee that it's not going somewhere else, right? I mean, common sense, but not everyone has common sense. Yes?
How much does it cost? Like, what's
The cost of a podcast really depends. First of all, it's time more than anything else. You can get a digital recorder like this. I don't know what it goes for now. I'm going to say $300. You could get a microphone for $100. You can get free software, which I'll tell you about in a few minutes. So if you look at that and go, okay, $400, we're done, let's go. But you have to learn how to do it, right? And you need a place to host the files, which I'll talk about later. So it really depends. If you have in-house expertise and there's not a learning curve there, if I had to quote for an organization, you would go anywhere. You could be anywhere from $500 to $1,500 for an episode. It really depends on what they want. Do they have 4 people being interviewed? Is it 2? Are they all in the same room? Are some of them in California? Do we have to, There's a whole bunch of permutations. Is it 15 minutes? Is it an hour? There's lots of variables. It's just like if I said to you, how much does it cost to write something, Rick, right? You'd say, well, it depends. So podcasts definitely can be part of your content marketing. It's just another way to reach people and to give them that useful, interesting information that has value to them. And just as with everything else we talk about in this course, whether it's video or your blog, we have to always think about what we're trying to accomplish with this. You would never go to your director of marketing and say, I think we should do a podcast because it would be fun. I don't know about you. I could never approach someone and say that. Well, why would we do this? How would we measure the success of the podcast? Is it just the number of downloads? Probably not. We're probably looking for some kind of an outcome. Like with the YMCA, this simple, humble podcast that we did, I think it was a series of 6. We wanted to see if we could move the needle on the donations, but also to get people to talk about it. If the development person ran into one of the donors, was there a conversation there about how they listened to this podcast and how it made them feel and did it influence their behavior? So lots to think about before you start so that you don't spin your wheels. Yes? How do you advertise a podcast? So in other words, if you're producing a podcast and you want people to know about it? Well, that's a big subject. You'd want to start with, first of all, making sure it has a good name, not like mine. Good cover art, something that would attract people so that if they were perusing through iTunes, they go, oh, what's that about? So the name and the cover art, but the content most of all. And you want to really get that word of mouth where people listen to it and say, this is really good, just like some of you will do, right? Like my daughter came home, you have to listen to Serial, it's so great. Sometimes in a network, people will promote each other's podcasts. That was one of the reasons why Serial was so successful, because they were hooked into other successful podcasts like This American Life. They were from the same production people. So everything that you would do to promote your blog, you would do to promote your podcast as well. Yes?
So in that case, is it possible to post like mini skits or blurbs of the podcast?
Yes. Mini blurbs. In fact, there is a tool called Clammr, C-L-A-M-M-R, and that's exactly what that is. They're trying to be the Twitter of audio. So you could post a very short clip, I think it's 17 seconds or something like that, talk about being brief. And the idea is that people will share that. And you've clued into something, is that it's harder for us usually to share audio. If I'm reading your blog post, whether on my desktop or on my phone, it's pretty easy for me to share that with somebody. If I'm listening to your podcast on the treadmill at the gym and I think, this is the best podcast episode ever, how do I share that if I'm listening at the gym? I'm probably not going to do that. Then I'm going to get home and forget about it. So the idea with Clammr was to make it easy to share those little snippets. And there are other services out there, but Clammr has really become popular among podcasters anyway. So people have written books about how to promote your podcast, but think about everything that you would do for your blog, and then just think in terms of audio. So a lot of it's word of mouth. You can't pay Apple to get on the front page of New and Noteworthy. They actually have human curators who choose these things. People always want to know, how much does it cost? Well, you can't. So it's not just about technology and gear. The concept has to be good. The conversation, if it's a conversation, has to be meaningful. People often get obsessed about gear and start talking about microphones before they even know what their podcast is about, and that's a mistake, I think. So it's not just about the technology, but sound matters and the quality matters. In 2007, you could get away with having a crackly sounding podcast because there weren't that many choices, but I don't know about you, if I start listening to someone and they sound like they're in the Lincoln Tunnel or underwater, I'm not going to listen. I'm going to go on to something else. Don't waste my time. To me, having really bad audio quality is like handing someone your first draft of something. And those of you who write for a living, imagine just whipping out a first draft and go, here, I'm done. That's what, to me, this bad audio quality is the same thing. Someone not taking the time to edit and to make it sound like it's worth listening to. Everyone always wants to know about the techniques and the tools, so I'll tell you about a few of those. There's Audacity, which some of you will have heard of, and that's freely available. It works on Mac, PC, and Linux. Adobe Audition is on Mac and PC, but is not free. It's part of the Adobe family of products. If you have a Mac, you have GarageBand built into your system. So those would be the three main ones. There are many others. If you go to PodCamp, like I did last weekend, people are talking about these programs that most of us have never heard of, but they think it's the best thing ever. So if you're working with someone and they have something and they know how to use it, that's fine as long as it works. Two of my favorite inexpensive microphones. This one I'm using here is a lapel microphone. I can't even tell you what brand it is because it's on my back now, but I've had this one for like 10 years. This one on the left, the Audio Technica, I really like that one because I can plug it into a digital recorder like this. Oops, don't press any buttons. You can plug it in here, or you can also plug it in USB to your computer. So it's like getting two microphones in one. The funny looking one on the right, the Blue Yeti, is just USB. I have one of those too, and it's very retro looking, and it also has different settings so that you can use it for one person talking or two people or for the whole room, things like that. So the prices have come way down on these. It used to be you had to I'd go to a music store and I'd spend a couple of $100s on these things, and now you can get them lots of different places. A lot of people order them online, and a lot of them are around $100 or less. Yes, Rick? Are there studios where you can go to record? Yes, you can. The Toronto Public Library at Bloor and Yonge there, just north of Bloor, they have a studio that you can use freely. Now, it's not a sound booth. They have the gear there, but it's not like a soundproof booth that you would get in a real studio. If you go to a regular studio, you're going to pay $50, $100 an hour for the use of the room or more, depending on the studio. Most of us don't need a studio. You couldn't record in this room with that noise coming through there. I would not record in this room. But a lot of organizations, the boardroom is fine for recording. So it's not really necessary to go to a studio. If you're on the go and you need to record, you don't want to have your computer and microphone with you, you would use something like this that I'm using tonight. This is the same one. It's the Zoom H4n, called the Handy Recorder. I could use these built-in microphones if I want. Looks like a taser, right? It's fun when you're in an elevator. You can use the built-in stereo mics, or you could do what I do, which is to plug in. You can plug in up to two microphones. In this case, I'm using the lapel. Often you would use something like the Audio Technica where you could go back and forth, or you could just have two lapel mics, right? You could also hook it up to a mixer if you had a lot of people, but most of us don't have to do anything quite that sophisticated. What if the person is in another location? It's nice if you're together and you can have the conversation, but I often interview people who are far away. Even when I talked to Allison, we were both home in different locations, and I was able to I actually use Zencaster. If you don't have, and I'll tell you what that is in a second, most people would use something like Skype, which enables the conversation but not the recording. Skype doesn't have a native recording built in. So I would use Call Recorder on my Mac, or if you're on a PC, you might use something else like Pamela. But the new kid on the block is Zencaster. And what's cool about that for podcasters like me is that it's web-based. So if I want to interview you, say I'm going to interview Simi, I just say, okay, I send you a link. Open this in your browser. You don't need to download anything, especially people at work. They're not allowed to download anything, right? It records you on your end and me on my end separately. So I don't get any of that Skypey weird noise happening. And then at the end of the conversation, it uploads Simi's file and my file to my cloud account. Boom. And because I have a paid account, I can do it in an uncompressed format, which has a really high quality. With a free account, you can do it as an MP3. For most of us, that's perfectly fine. But if you're an audio nerd, you have to go for the uncompressed. Anyway, Zencaster I think is really cool, and they're out of beta now, and a lot of podcasters are adopting it because it really improves the quality of those remote conversations. How do we do this stuff? Every podcaster has a different workflow. It's hilarious. Everyone you talk to says, no, you must do it like this. And I say, do whatever works for you. But this is what works for me. The planning up front, just like with any communication project, is really, really important. What is this about? First of all, the whole podcast itself, but then for each episode, what is this about? What are we trying to accomplish? Who should we talk to? What should the conversation be about? All that kind of planning. Similar to, in some cases, to what you would do before any kind of interview for even print, but then there's that added dimension of audio. How would this sound? Do I have 3 guests who all sound the same? Maybe that won't work. Or do I have an expert who's brilliant but sounds boring? I've had people like that where I didn't vet them ahead of time, and I think Allison's heard this example before. This is literally what the person said on the recording. I'm really happy to be here today to talk to you. It's like, oh no, what a mistake. I didn't talk to this person. I don't know what she sounds like. She's not audio friendly.
Did you get peppier? Or
well, yes, I think I compensated, and the funniest thing is I actually wound up publishing it because she was talking about a subject I really cared about. It was about accents. I'm really into linguistics and accents, and she was like a world-renowned PhD in the area of accents. Brilliant.
But she had a flat.
She had it wasn't even an accent. It was just it was her tone. So I compensated by being cheery and animated, and I usually am. Like, I would often stand and use my hands when I talk because that's the way I talk. It's really hard for me to stand in one spot. Those who are in my class know, like, normally I'd be going back and forth. So I published the thing, and some of my friends sent me comments saying, well, one of you was really excited about that interview. So I learned a lesson there. Do the pre-interview if you've never heard the person's voice. It sounds so obvious, but I didn't know. I was a new podcaster. Now I know better.
That's why the CBC and all the radio stations,
they all do. The producer will do the pre-interview, exactly. And even TV shows, do you think, when Jerry Seinfeld goes on Jimmy Fallon or something, do you think they already know what the conversation is going to be? So you got a new cat, Jerry. Obviously he knows you got a new cat. So we do the recording, whether it's in person or remotely. Sometimes we're using music or stingers or something. I like to break up the segments if we're doing that. And the final step, and I'm really truncating this here, like what I've just told you could take 3 hours. The final step there is to save it as an MP3, which is that nice small compressed file. You don't want to be having this giant WAV file that's 200 megabytes. And now that file has to live somewhere. You have that audio file. You can't just leave it on your computer because the world can't access it, and you want the world to listen to your podcast, right? So a lot of people like me will use a service called Libsyn. It stands for Liberated Syndication, and you pay anywhere from $7 to $20 a month. Most of us pay $7 to $10, which is nothing, I think, to have your files stored on their servers, and you get statistics from them, and they're very reliable and they're wonderful. If you're a big organization, you probably will keep it on your own server. You just need to have it live somewhere. And then you're just pointing to that file. And then you're going to publish that. And the easiest way for most of us to publish our podcast is on a blog. That's the way I do mine. And I use a plugin for WordPress. You can't use it for WordPress.com, but for a self-hosted site, it's called Simple Podcast Press. There's a guy in Toronto, Hani Mora, who developed it and launched it at PodCamp last year. And it's a really nice interface. I'll show you in a second what it looks like. And then, of course, you want to share that. Just publishing it, just like with your blog post. One of the questions we had in class about blogging was, well, what happens after I publish it? The whole world isn't going to see it. You need to tell the world about it. So it's the same thing with your podcast. Yes, Allison?
If any of our students want to do a mini podcast,
yeah,
a couple of episodes on their blogs, what's your advice? Should they, because I know WordPress.com in the support website says you can upload audio, but it doesn't
No,
always
it's
work.
too small a file.
It's too small. So should they upload to SoundCloud?
I would do SoundCloud. In fact, I recommended that to my students previously, is that just use SoundCloud. If you're only doing small files, you can get a free account. And I'm not sure if WordPress.com will allow the embed, but you can at least link to it. But you can also share it on social media, so you can share it on Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Adam? Yes, you can use Google Drive. The nice thing about SoundCloud is it makes the sharing really pretty. It looks nice, and people can leave comments quite easily and stuff. And you can put some visuals. Yes, Reka?
What percentage?
I have no idea how many business websites have podcasts. I don't know. Sometimes they'll just have snippets of audio, and here's an interview with the CEO, but it's not really a podcast. It's just audio. Or they'll have videos. I couldn't tell you what the percentage is. I mean, certainly we know the trend is toward video, but we're also seeing the trend toward more audio. And I'm seeing that even in Toronto with organizations saying, I think we need a podcast. Whereas 5 years ago, they were saying, what's a podcast? And now they're understanding that there can be value in having that kind of material online. Yes?
And so how does the
So Anya's asking how it makes its way toward iTunes. And this is a little technical, but not really. Some of you know what an RSS feed is. Okay, your blog has an RSS feed. Well, someone invented a way to add an enclosure to an RSS feed, and in this case, the enclosure is that MP3 file. This is what something like Simple Podcast Press has automated for us. Back in the day, when I started, you had to go through a little trouble to get that attachment, okay? Now, you get that RSS feed, and you say, this is what my RSS feed is for my overall show, okay, whatever the name of it is. You give that to iTunes. You go to Apple iTunes and you set up an account, you put in your email, all that stuff, and it says, what's your RSS feed for your podcast? And you plug that in, and a human being at Apple will listen. I don't think they listen to the whole thing, but they want to make sure it's not hate speech or something awful. You're allowed to use explicit language as long as you label it like that, but they want to make sure you're not breaking any laws with your podcast. So once they approve it, takes a couple days, then you're listed on iTunes. There are consultants who actually tell people, I can get you on iTunes, as if you need some magic wand. But anyone can get on iTunes. Yes, Rika?
When you're writing your outline, you don't write it, you just...
No, this is a good question. Should you script? Because I say on here to write an outline. Some people script, and I know people. P.W. Fenton is a friend of mine in Florida. He is a storyteller. He's brilliant. He scripts everything, but he's also a voice actor. He reads that story, you're weeping. He's telling you about when he was a child on the roller coaster with his father at Coney Island. I can listen to that every week and I would get goosebumps because he's such a great storyteller and he reads it so well. Most of us don't have that talent. And what I usually advise clients is lightly script or just do an outline. So that, because what happens is if you write it out, people are stilted and they'll often say, well, I've written it out, but don't worry, I know how to read it. And I say, well, would you give me permission to tell you if it sounds like you're reading? And they say, of course. Well, within 90 seconds, I'm saying, Bob, I'm sorry, but it sounds like you're reading. Really? Yes, it does. I'm really happy to be here today, that type of thing. So I always say, look, it's audio and we can edit it. So if you need to look at your notes, look at your notes. Pause, do that, it's fine. So the outline gives us some structure. Let's make sure we hit these 5 points or whatever. But for most of us, writing out a whole script is not a great idea. I actually wrote an ebook called the Podcast Scripting Book that talks about this very subject, when to script, when not to script, if you do decide to script, how to do it, and if you do decide to read your script, how to read it to sort of fool people. It's kind of mean, but anyway, there are ways to do it. For most of us, I think having an exact script is no good. Now, Terry was reading his novel. P.W. Fenton is reading a wonderful story that he wrote, and he wants it to be perfect the way he wrote it. That's totally different. For most of us, if we're going to have a conversation about blogging, and I'm going to say, so Anya, tell me about your blog. What's new? What's happening in your blog? You know, I don't want you to read off a script to tell me. I want you to say, I'm really excited about this new post that I wrote, right? So we want to have that genuine kind of conversation. That's the nice thing about podcasts. They can be conversations like that. So that's a typical workflow, as I said. Everyone has a different idea. This is mostly the way I do it but as I said, there's a lot that happens, you know, record, edit. Well, for me, for every 15 minutes of recording, there's probably an hour of editing. Unless I'm really lucky, like when Allison and I did that little clip for IABC, we didn't make any flubs, and I was able to basically, don't tell people how fast I did that. It was like in an hour, it was online, probably, and I had to record the intro separately. That's a trick. I usually do the intro after the conversation so that I can give some highlight of what we just talked about. Search engines do not index audio. You probably know this already if you think about it, right? So you write your blog post, you put your keywords, you have categories, you have tags, you have alt tags on your pictures. You're telling Google, this is what my blog post is about. You can't easily do that with audio. So we have this thing called show notes, which are usually the bane of every podcaster's existence. I just had this conversation. Why do I have to write something now? Well, you have to if you want your podcast to be discovered by a search engine. This is an example from my blog, a blog post that I did about fake news, and there's a topic for you. Blogging for business and remembering Bob Goyette, who was a leading Canadian podcaster who unfortunately passed away a few months ago. When I mentioned Clamour, you'll see Clamour right there. So this is Simple Podcast Press that I use. So it has all this stuff built in. You click on iTunes, you go to my iTunes account, leave a review. Clamour it will let you make a little clip and all this other good stuff. But you see all this text here. I'm telling people and also Google what this is about, and I have links there. So I have a list of fake news sites, a Chrome extension for flagging fake news. So if you're listening to this on the treadmill, you go, well, that's a good idea. I think I'll get that extension. And you get home and you go, what was the name of that thing that you talked about? You could just go to my show notes and all the information is there. Workshop, the book, I was talking about the Hot Docs Podcast Festival. The links are all there so that it's easy for my listeners to then access the information, plus I'm providing Google juice there for these things. So it's good for you as a podcaster, even though it's a pain to produce show notes. It's not the same as a transcript. You can do a transcript if you want. I find show notes are more useful. Most people don't want to read through 12 pages to find the reference to the piece of software that I mentioned, but I'll say right away, here's what I mentioned, and here it is, just quickly. One of the most common questions I get is, how long should a podcast be? And I usually say, as long as it needs to be. Everyone doesn't have to listen. If it's 45 minutes, we don't have to listen to the whole thing at once. We can stop and pick up the next time. But if I'm forced, I will say 18 to 20 minutes. It seems like a convenient number for a lot of people working out or commuting and things like that. But you know, when you work in radio, you're constrained by the clock. Anyone who's worked in radio knows you're always looking at the clock. We have 90 seconds, we have 60 seconds countdown. With a podcast, you're freed from that and you can have a lot more flexibility. That's a very good suggestion. The planning up front and being clear with the guest and setting boundaries. Like I remember having one guy, it was a client podcast, and they said, you have to talk to this fellow. And he was it was over Skype, he's very loquacious, he was like a Texan, and he goes, well, I'm going to tell you some stories, and you just find the good parts, and you'll just cut them out. And I was like, no, that's not how it works. I could picture myself being on the phone with this guy for like 3 hours while he spins these tales, and I have to get 10 minutes out of it. No. And I had to work hard to keep him focused, and I still had to edit quite a bit. But you're right, the more work you do up front, the better off you'll be. And if you just had this free-form conversation, people probably don't want to listen to that either. It's too out there. That's right. And I've done that. Yeah. 3 hours editing 20 minutes.
You could spend that 2 hours earlier, an hour earlier.
Right.
Getting prepared.
That's right. And what you suggested, is what I do is similar. I do it in a different way a little bit. I ask their permission ahead of time. Say, look, do you mind if I stop you, just like I said before, if you sound like you're reading, but, you know, and it's not you, it's just, you know, I only have 20 minutes, so I really need. So then now they want to help you. They want to help you with that mission, right? Well, if the question was, how do I direct them if I don't like the tone? And if I had been a better podcaster back in 2006 when I did that, I would have said something to her. First of all, I would have done the pre-interview, and so we probably wouldn't even have had the thing. But even if I did decide to use her, I might have said, you know, have you done a lot of radio or podcasts? And she would say no. And some people say, can you help me? Like they want to sound better. And then you can actually work with them. It depends on how much time you want to put into it. But sometimes you have to say to someone that it's just not going to work as a podcast. And I've had a few interviews where it's not because of their tone, it was just the content. And I thought, I won't serve my listeners well if I publish this. Then I have to tell the person. And I always make, you know, it's my fault. It's never their fault. So those are great suggestions and anyone who works in radio can have tales from the trenches, certainly. And of course, a lot of them started in, you know, editing tape, right? Razor blade, yeah. So I can't complain about using Audacity, right? So I just wanted to recommend a few podcasts for you that I like to listen to. Inside PR, that was the one that Terry Follis was involved with. Now it's Martin Waxman, Joe Thornley, and Ginny Dietrich. It's short and sweet, great about public relations. For immediate release is that one I mentioned that Shel Holtz does, his flagship show about marketing, public relations, digital media, social media. 6 Pixels of Separation is Mitch Joel's podcast about digital marketing. Ada's Sisters is one of our fellow instructors. Eden Spodek does it. It's about women in technology. She does it with Angela Misery, who was, I think, CBC at some point. Yeah. You all know each other.
She was one of the forefront of podcasts.
Yes. And then there's Radio Lab, which is beautifully produced, much more beautifully produced than I could ever dream of doing, but I love listening to it. Freakonomics was one I know a lot of previous students have liked. Anyone have a favorite podcast they want to recommend? Gimlet Media. Yeah. Good idea, Amanda. Anybody else? Yes.
I like listening to CBC.
Yeah, podcast playlist has really come along. And when they started it, it was just, I think it was just a Twitter feed or something. They didn't have a podcast, and they started the podcast. And of course, CBC has a lot of their radio shows that they then share as podcasts. Yes?
I have like 3.
3.
One is Somebody Knows Something.
Oh, yes, from
Which is
CBC.
like maple cereal, excellent.
Yeah.
Second season was excellent. Complete Guide to Everything, which is just sort of like a couple guys digressing about things a lot. The third one I recommend hesitantly because I love it, but it's really not for everyone, is Chapo Trap House, which is like, it's sort of like sardonic left American politics. It's like a bit angry and a bit bleak, and it's for sure like my girlfriend hates it, but I'm a big fan.
And yet you're together. That's
Yeah,
good.
yeah, for sure. That's
Yes.
like, she's not around.
So Pod Save America, it was created after Trump got elected. Basically, they interview moderate liberals.
Pod Safe America. I like that one. Yes.
My brother and me. It's I don't know if it's for everyone, but it's 3 brothers who basically answer questions on Yahoo Answers.
My brother, and me. That's good.
I like that one because they're always talking over each other, as you would if you were hanging out with your
Hard to listen to, though. I saw another hand. Allison.
If we're talking politics, I really like David Axelrod's podcast for CNN, The Axe Files. It's a lot of you guys know, he was Obama's campaign manager
Yeah.
going all the way back to 2004. He came up to Canada to help get McGuinty elected. Anyway, if you like behind the scenes of politics and how the machine works, and you like tales of being a politician, it's really good.
Yeah, no, that's good. And people do love behind the scenes kind of
Yeah.
content. Yeah. I do have information on my blog. If you just go to news.trafcom.com, I have the podcasting tip sheet. It's like a 4-page thing with tips about podcasting, just like the name says. And any other questions about podcasting before we have our break? Anyone feel a little bit more informed? Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned that one of the podcasts was really well produced. So what would be some of the criteria?
Oh, that's a good question. What makes well produced? Well, I mentioned Radio Lab. It's the texture of the sound. It's the, pardon? It's beautifully mixed, and as an audio person, you can hear it probably much better than I can. Anyone who's actually done kind of radio work. Great interviews, sometimes very funny, but it's just beautiful sound the way it's put together. Yes.
I love the conversational tone of Radio Lab as well.
Yeah.
I always feel like I'm in the room talking, and I feel like it's super relaxed. Like it's just a bunch of people hanging out in a coffee shop. There's really interesting people.
Yes, but there's also a structure to it, so the story's always moving ahead. One of my favorites was the Glomar one. Like, see, I mean, it's amazing. Of all the episodes out there, we both now know that one. Just look up Glomar. It's amazing. Anyway, any other questions before we break? Does anyone feel a little bit more informed about podcasting now? Good, it's not so mysterious. Excellent. Thank you so much for your attention and your questions.